Some secrets die completely, but some merely sleep beneath the soil, waiting for the day someone pulls at their roots. That morning, when Miss Marple clipped a withered rose in her garden, perhaps an old story fell with it, yet not every story that falls is buried forever. Sometimes, what seems lost is merely waiting for the right moment to resurface. And so, on that quiet morning in Mary, the first thread of a new mystery had already begun to unravel. The village of Marry-me awoke under the reluctant yawn of dawn, mist curling like ghostly fingers around weathered cobblestones and whitewashed cottages that bore the weight of history in their bones. The gardens, prim and disciplined, whispered with the soft hum of bees, while in her modest yet immaculately kept garden, Miss Marple knelt before a bed of late-blooming roses, deftly extracting a weed that had dared encroach upon her domain. Her gloves, once a pristine cream, bore the stains of countless mornings spent in quiet battle with nature, yet her wide-brimmed hat, ever practical and ever sensible, remained defiantly spotless. The stillness of the morning was broken by the familiar voice of Mrs. Pick, who leaned over the low stone wall separating their gardens, her voice a curious mixture of warmth and barely concealed mischief. "Morning, Miss Marple," she called, the words tumbling from her lips like an eager secret. She was wrapped in a floral apron dusted with flour, a sign of a morning already spent in domestic pursuits, yet her eyes gleamed with something far less ordinary. "I don't suppose you've heard about Lady Hensley." Miss Marple, removing her gloves with a practiced tug, merely lifted a brow. Mrs. Pick needed no further encouragement. "A terrible business it is. Sir Alister's plane crashed, they say. An accident, though if you ask me, accidents don't come knocking on a man like him without reason." Miss Marple's fingers stilled for just a fraction of a second before she smoothed her skirts. "Accidents," she murmured, "are rarely without purpose, Mrs. Pick. They have a peculiar way of arriving precisely when they are most convenient for someone." Mrs. Pick's expression flickered, as if the thought had only just occurred to her, but before she could reply, the crisp footsteps of Mr. Green, the village postman, approached. His uniform, though well worn, remained impeccably neat, his step brisk despite the years that had settled upon him like a comfortable coat. "Morning, Miss Marple," he greeted, extending a thick envelope sealed in an ominous black wax. "This one's a bit fancier than usual, straight from Hensley Manor." Miss Marple accepted the letter, her fingers grazing the heavy parchment, her thumb running along the deep imprint of an ornate crest. Black wax, so dramatic, so deliberate. Lady Elena Hensley was not a woman prone to theatrics, which meant the contents of this letter would be no ordinary affair. As Mr. Green departed with a knowing nod, she turned the envelope over once, twice, then rose, the weight of unspoken words already settling in her bones. Inside her cottage, the air was laced with the familiar scent of tea and old books, the lace doilies carefully placed upon dark wood furniture, speaking to a life of meticulous order. The grandfather clock ticked with quiet insistence as she fetched her silver letter opener, a modest, well-loved thing, gifted by a neighbor with more gratitude than wealth, and sliced through the wax with the precision of a woman well versed in unraveling secrets. The letter inside was written in a firm, precise hand, devoid of unnecessary flourishes, its tone as measured as the woman who had written it. "Dear Miss Marple, I write to you under troubling circumstances. My husband Sir Alister, as you may have heard, perished recently in what authorities have deemed an accident. Yet there are inconsistencies, matters I cannot discuss openly. I implore you to visit Hensley Manor at your earliest convenience. Your discretion, as always, is valued beyond words." Signed, Lady Elena Hensley. Miss Marple read the letter twice, her frown deepening with each pass. Inconsistencies, a word far too polite for what usually amounted to deceit, desperation, and often enough, murder. Sir Alister Hensley had been a man of brilliance and ambition, a figure who had drawn admiration and suspicion in equal measure. His ventures into communication technology had been groundbreaking, yet ambition, in a place like Marie, was often viewed with the same suspicion as scandal. Folding the letter carefully, she reached for her tea, now lukewarm, and took a thoughtful sip. Outside, the village carried on, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath its serene exterior. Secrets, she had always believed, were much like strong tea. Left to steep too long, they grew bitter, dark and dangerous. Placing her cup down with quiet finality, she rose, the decision already made. Hensley Manor awaited, and with it, no doubt, a tangled web of lies waiting for the right hand to pull the thread. A hush settled over Ravenswood as dawn stretched pale fingers through the mist. The grand estate perched like a silent sentry over the sleeping village below. The morning air carried the scent of damp earth and roses left to wither on their stems, a whisper of something forgotten yet lingering. Within the manor's sprawling gardens, Eleanor Whitmore knelt beside a bed of frost-kissed lavender, her gloved hands brushing against brittle stems, her expression a careful mask. The air hummed with a stillness too deliberate to be natural, a silence weighted with unsaid things. The village, usually a patchwork of morning gossip and clattering tea sets, had grown muted in the wake of Lord Whitmore's untimely passing, an accident, they said, though Eleanor had never been one for simple answers. The great house, its towering facade, a monument to old money and older secrets, loomed behind her, its ivy-choked walls as much a prison as a refuge. A sudden rustling from the hedge made her stiffen, but it was only Mrs. Harrow, the housekeeper, making her way across the gravel path, a crisp envelope in hand, its wax seal dark as blood. "Another one, ma'am," she said, her tone clipped but edged with unease. Eleanor took the letter, her fingers tracing the raised crest, the weight of the paper, heavier than mere parchment. The first had arrived 3 days prior, a single sentence scrawled in an unfamiliar hand. Accidents are seldom accidents. She had burned it in the library fireplace, the embers swallowing her mounting dread. The second had been delivered in the dead of night, slipped beneath her study door, with no footprint left in the snow-dusted corridor. You know, so do they. And now the third. Eleanor exhaled, unfolding the letter with practiced calm. Some truths refused to stay buried. Midnight, the bell tower. The words were stark, precise, an invitation and a threat woven into ink. She felt the house behind her, felt its windows like eyes, unblinking, watching. Whitmore had always said that knowledge was a dangerous thing, that the wrong hands could twist brilliance into ruin. And now, ruin had come. Somewhere within the house the old grandfather clock struck the hour, its chime swallowed too quickly by the thick stone walls, as though the manor itself was trying to smother time. Eleanor straightened, her resolve cooling into something sharper. If there were answers to be found, they lay beyond the veil of whispers and candlelit corridors, past the facades of mourning and propriety. She turned back toward the house, her steps careful, measured, her mind already weaving the web of questions that needed answering. The letter remained clutched in her grip, the ink smudging slightly under the pressure of her thumb. Midnight. The bell tower. She would go, and God help her, she would not go alone. The manor stood silent, a great stone beast curled against the cold embrace of night, its turrets clawing at the mist-laden sky. Within its cavernous halls, the hush was unnatural, a silence too deep, too knowing. Lydia Ashford, widow of the late industrialist James Ashford, sat in the drawing-room, the dim glow of a single lamp casting flickering shadows against the high walls, her fingers absently twisting the hem of her silk cuff. Across from her, Miss Beatrice Holloway observed, knitting needles absent, but her mind weaving patterns all the same, tracing the unspoken tremors in Lydia's voice, the hesitation between words. "You doubt the official account," Miss Holloway murmured, her voice soft yet weighted. Lydia's gaze dropped to the folded letter in her lap, its edges worn from restless handling. "James was meticulous," she said finally, cautious to the point of obsession. The idea that she swallowed a tight motion, "It doesn't fit." She lifted the letter, hesitant. And then there's this." The paper crackled as Miss Holloway took it, smoothing its creases with careful fingers. The ink, hurried yet deliberate, carried the faintest smudge, as though a hand had trembled. "Lydia, if you receive this, it means my suspicions were correct. Do not trust the explanations they give you. It was never an accident. The tunnels, remember the tunnels, they hold more than history, more than memory, they hold the truth. Burn this. Tell no one." Miss Holloway read it twice, her mind assembling the puzzle before her. Tunnels. A house of this age had many secrets, and those buried beneath the ground were often the most dangerous of all. A knock at the door fractured the heavy silence, and the butler entered with the air of someone both dutiful and burdened. "The guests have arrived, madam," Lydia inhaled sharply. "Send them in." The procession entered in careful steps, faces arranged like masks at a masquerade, each carrying their own weight of knowledge, their own veiled intent. First Dr. Edwin Harrow, a man of sharp cheekbones and sharper intellect, his fingers perpetually stained with ink, the scent of antiseptic trailing him like a ghost. Next Marianne Hale, young and wide-eyed, her golden curls pinned too tightly, as if trying to contain the tension coiled in her spine. Beside her, Colonel Stephen Radcliffe, rigid and polished, his uniform pristine, his gaze assessing in a way that suggested he knew more than he admitted. Then came Victor Langley, his smile practiced, his presence an enigma, a man who thrived in the spaces between truth and deception. Finally, Sophia Duval, her entrance a disruption, her dark eyes keen, her silk scarf, a whisper of foreign lands and unspoken pasts. She did not sit. Instead she let her gaze settle on Miss Holloway, a knowing smirk curling the corner of her lips. "They say you unravel things others prefer remain hidden," she said smoothly. Miss Holloway returned the smile, far gentler but no less pointed. "Only what people weave for themselves, my dear." The weight in the room shifted, anticipation settling like dust in the heavy air. Lydia's hands clenched in her lap. "James didn't trust them," she said, voice brittle. "Any of them." Dr. Harrow exhaled, the sound measured. "Perhaps," he said, "but the dead leave behind more than words." His gaze flickered downward, toward the thick rug beneath their feet, and Miss Holloway followed it, her mind piecing together the edges of something unseen yet waiting. She pressed a gloved hand against the armrest, her voice light yet laced with an undercurrent of knowing. "Secrets," she mused, "have a way of refusing to stay buried, and my dear Lady Ashford, no matter how deep they're hidden, the truth," her eyes swept the gathered faces, lingering on the shifting shadows in their expressions, "always finds a way to the surface." The grandfather clock struck the hour, its chimes swallowed too quickly by the walls, as though even the house itself sought to silence time. But time, Miss Holloway knew, had a habit of speaking when one least expected it. The chandeliers of Cravenwood Manor cast a dim glow, but beneath that light lay an unease, as if the air itself was trying to conceal a secret. Lady Eleanor Prescott's lips tightened slightly, as Miss Evelyn Graves cast her an inviting yet scrutinizing look. "Might I trouble you for a brief look around, Lady Eleanor?" Near the entrance, a butler named Parker watched with composed attentiveness, but Miss Graves simply smiled. "I find I do my best work when left to think alone." Lady Eleanor sighed. "Very well, but Charlotte will accompany you," her tone making it clear that Charlotte's presence was more about supervision than assistance. Charlotte Prescott, as if weighed down by an unseen burden, followed Miss Graves in silence, her footsteps forming an uneasy rhythm against the parquet floor. "It's just a study," Charlotte murmured. Sir Alistair disliked people meddling in his papers. Miss Graves' lips curved into a quiet, knowing smile. "People rarely want others prying into the cages of their lives, but when death leaves unanswered questions, only mysteries remain." The study door creaked open like an ancient trunk, and inside, the air held a peculiar blend of order and disarray. Books lined the shelves, though some lay open, their pages whispering of deep thought and restless intellect. The lingering scent of tobacco and old ink clung to the room's confines, but Miss Graves' sharp gaze landed on something else, an unexpected guest forgotten amidst the artifacts of intellect. A jade carving, its form eerie and unsettling, as though it had found its way here by some unseen design. Its deep green surface bore intricate engravings, the kind that seemed too alive for mere decoration. An interesting piece, Miss Graves mused, her voice thoughtful. Charlotte shifted, discomfort flickering in her eyes. It was a gift. Sir Alister said it wasn't just a keepsake, but a message. Miss Graves examined without touching, and yet it's covered in dust, while everything else in this room has been handled. Charlotte's gaze darted toward the door, as if fearing unseen ears. He believed he was being followed, and somehow this was part of it. Her voice wavered like a clue left hanging in the air. Miss Graves turned to the desk, where an old fountain pen rested above unfinished writing, its ink dried mid-thought, as if the hand that held it had hesitated, or been interrupted. Papers were scattered, blueprints, complex equations that only a trained mind could decipher. Then something else caught her eye, a torn photograph, its jagged edges peeking from beneath an old ledger. Without hesitation, she slid it free. A sepia-toned image, 3 men standing near an unmarked grave, and a fourth whose face had been so meticulously torn away that only the faintest ghost of its presence remained, as if someone had deliberately erased him from existence. Charlotte paled. I didn't know that was here." Miss Graves offered a gentle yet unsettling smile. "There are many things, dear Charlotte, that you don't know. People keep secrets locked away in little compartments, until someone forces them open." The air in the room seemed to grow colder for a moment. Miss Graves cast a final glance at the jade carving, its hidden engravings whispering an ancient tale, one that only the right eyes could read. In the shifting light, the markings seemed to shift, like a lifeless thing beginning to stir. Somewhere deep beneath Cravenwood, within its buried walls, something remained, something that had never truly been laid to rest. Cravenwood Manor's study, shrouded in the dim glow of an oil lamp, felt heavy with the weight of unsaid words and unseen eyes, as if the walls themselves bore witness to secrets long buried. Miss Evelyn Graves, ever composed, let her fingertips hover over the polished mahogany desk before easing open the top drawer, an act that to an untrained eye appeared routine, but she knew better. The scent of aged parchment, mingled with a whisper of tobacco, curled around her senses as she sifted through its contents: correspondence, ink-stained envelopes, a silver letter opener dulled with time. But it was beneath these relics of propriety that her fingers met resistance: a leather-bound journal, its edges worn, its spine creased as though it had been opened and closed in hesitation. With practiced ease, she flipped through the pages, her keen gaze narrowing as she traced hurried, slanted script. A name crossed out with violent strokes of ink, a date, matching the night Sir Alister Prescott had taken his last breath. And then an unfinished sentence, the pen's tip having bled into the paper as if its writer had been interrupted mid-thought. "If you find this, know that." The rest was an abyss of blankness. A gust of wind rattled the window pane, and she stilled. The study had been locked when she arrived, yet the atmosphere carried the unsettling charge of a presence unaccounted for. Methodically, she shut the journal, and straightened, her movement fluid, unhurried. The door creaked open, and in its frame stood Colonel Richard Vane, his expression a mask of casual indifference, betrayed only by the subtle shift of his stance, the kind a trained soldier makes when preparing for an encounter he cannot fully control. Something of interest. His voice was smooth, but his eyes flickered to the journal, a fraction too quickly. Miss Graves allowed a polite smile to surface. "Curious, isn't it? The way the past refuses to stay buried." She let her words settle, watching as a muscle tightened along his jawline. "Photographs are meant for remembrance," she added lightly, drawing a folded sepia print from her handbag and holding it up to the lamplight. "The image once whole, now bore the cruel evidence of tampering. 3 figures stood in a grand hall, crystal chandeliers overhead, casting an ethereal glow, but where a 4th should have been, there was only absence, torn away with reckless precision. Strange, don't you think? People only erase what they cannot face. Vane's fingers twitched at his side, before he exhaled, measured. Alistair met all kinds, he said, his tone carefully devoid of commitment, some worth remembering, others not so much. Miss Graves hummed in agreement, slipping the photograph back into her bag, and yet, memories have a way of returning when least expected. Silence stretched between them, thick as the dust motes dancing in the lamplight, before he finally dipped his head in a stiff nod. "If you'll excuse me," he murmured, turning on his heel, his departure marked by the muted weight of his footsteps receding down the corridor. She watched the door click shut, then, with a careful breath, returned to the desk. A briefcase rested near its legs, unremarkable in its presence, yet its brass clasps gleamed too freshly against its otherwise worn exterior. Kneeling, she flipped it open. Inside, documents lay in meticulous order, but it was the notebook, nestled at the bottom, that captured her attention. Its pages bore sketches of mechanisms, calculations beyond her immediate comprehension. But it was the lining, frayed ever so slightly at the seams, that beckoned her intuition. With delicate precision, she peeled it back, revealing an anomaly, white thread, meticulously stitched in zigzagging rows, weaving a pattern only meant to be seen by those who knew where to look. She reached for a pencil, tracing the lines onto a scrap of paper. A code, no doubt. Her mind, sharp as ever, worked through the sequence. Within moments, words began to take shape. Echo project. A concept of repetition, or surveillance. She leaned in, another phrase emerging beneath her fingertips. The root of betrayal. A tension curled in her chest. Betrayal. The word was intimate, heavy with implication. A matter of power. Revenge? She exhaled, smoothing the lining back into place, before closing the briefcase with a soft click. Outside, the night stretched on, the manor's grounds whispering with the hush of the wind through skeletal branches. Somewhere, buried in the darkness of history and intent, lay the truth, and Miss Graves intended to unearth it, no matter what lay in wait. Beneath a sky heavy with storm clouds, the manor stood in eerie silence, its walls burdened with secrets no one dared to speak. The air was thick, not just with the scent of damp wood and faded polish, but with something more insidious, unspoken truths lurking in the shadows. Miss Eleanor Ashford let out a slow breath, her gaze lingering on the garden path outside, as if the earth beneath held the answers she sought. "Everything follows a pattern," she murmured, "whether it's a crime or a lie. You only need to pull the right thread, for it all to unravel." Inside, the study, once Sir Adrian Blackwood's sanctuary, had turned into a silent battleground, every object placed with precision, yet betraying the tension of something deeply disturbed. The first to enter was Lady Evelyn Montrose. Her crimson lips curled into a soft smile, but her eyes glinted with something unreadable. "Strange, isn't it, Eleanor?" she whispered, taking a seat. "Sir Adrian wasn't just a man, he was a puzzle, and puzzles are meant to be solved." Miss Ashford's gaze dropped to the silk handkerchief in Lady Evelyn's hand, a delicate thing, embroidered with golden thread, except for a single corner, stained with what looked suspiciously like blood. "Do you think someone planned his death, or was it simply fate?" Lady Evelyn gave a quiet laugh, one that barely masked something darker beneath. "Fate is for those who believe in accidents. This was no accident." The door creaked open again, and Dr. Sebastian Grayson entered, a man who resembled a well-worn book. No matter how much one read, the most important pages remained unreadable. His expression was carefully blank, though a tension in his posture betrayed him. "Miss Ashford," he began, voice measured, "you are a brilliant observer, but some truths are best left undisturbed." Eleanor turned a page in her notebook, scribbling a single thought. "Fear is always the strongest evidence. You were close to Sir Adrian," she remarked casually. "Some would say, too close." He hesitated, just for a second, before letting out a humorless smile. "We were all close to him in our own ways, Miss Ashford, but some relationships run deeper than others, deeper than most will ever know." The study fell silent except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock, each second stretching the space between them. Then, as if on cue, Colonel Edgar Henshaw stepped in, his presence sharp, his movements precise, like a soldier always prepared for war. He took his seat with the quiet authority of a man who had seen far worse than this. "Sir Adrian was dangerous," he stated flatly, his voice edged with something close to warning. "No man walks too close to the fire and expects not to burn." Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "Are you saying he knew something he wasn't meant to?" The colonel's fingers tightened against the chair's armrest, knuckles paling. "I'm saying that knowledge is a weapon, and weapons in the wrong hands, well, they don't remain in hands for long." A pause, a flicker of something in his gaze, quickly buried. Eleanor's pen scratched softly against paper as she wrote, "Duty or fear? Only time will decide." The air in the study had turned colder, and not from the weather outside. This wasn't just a murder, it was a game, and every single person in this house was playing their part. The real question was who had written the rules. The heavy rain drummed against the stained glass windows of Blackwood Hall, each drop a whisper of the secrets buried within its walls. The air was thick with the scent of old books and something less identifiable, something metallic, almost like blood. Miss Evelyn Harrow stood by the grand fireplace, the flickering light casting long distorted shadows against the wood-paneled walls. Her fingers grazed the rim of a crystal glass though she hadn't taken a sip. Across from her, Dr. Julian Mercer adjusted his cufflinks, the gesture precise, controlled, like a man accustomed to hiding what he truly felt. "So the inquisitive mind turns its gaze upon me," he murmured, settling into the armchair with a slow, deliberate grace. "A tragic accident, a matter of unfortunate timing, and yet here you are seeking ghosts where none exist." Miss Harrow's smile was faint, unreadable. "Ghosts rarely leave footprints, Doctor, and yet, there they are." Her gaze flicked toward the polished floorboards where faint scuff marks betrayed movement near the study, the very place where Lord Blackwood had drawn his final breath. "I imagine your association with the late Lord was complicated." Mercer exhaled through his nose, something between amusement and irritation. The man was a genius, but geniuses often border on madness. He trusted no one, not even those who worked closest with him. His theories, his inventions, he guarded them as if knowledge itself was a blade that could cut the wrong hands. Perhaps it was. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, watching him. "And yet, you remained at his side." Mercer smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Loyalty is a peculiar thing, Miss Harrow. It binds men in ways they do not always understand." The study door creaked open again, and Lady Vivienne St. Clair entered, silk dress whispering against the floor, her perfume a sharp contrast to the musty air of the manor. "I do hope I'm not interrupting," she purred, settling into the wingback chair opposite Miss Harrow. "I couldn't help but overhear secrets, loyalty, madness. Such deliciously tragic words." Her painted nails tapped against the armrest. "Tell me, Evelyn, do you believe in accidents?" Miss Harrow regarded her carefully. "Accidents are convenient but seldom accidental." Vivienne's smile widened, feline in its satisfaction. "Then we have much to discuss." Before Evelyn could respond, the door opened once more, this time with the brisk efficiency of Colonel Sebastian Wren. His uniform was pristine, his expression unreadable, though his sharp eyes took in every detail of the room with the efficiency of a man accustomed to war. He did not sit, did not remove his gloves, he merely stood watching. Lord Blackwood was involved in something he shouldn't have been, he stated flatly. Dangerous men took notice. "You should be careful where you dig, Miss Harrow." She met his gaze without flinching. "Danger is often the shadow of truth, Colonel. and I am not afraid of the dark." He exhaled through his nose, something close to frustration flickering across his otherwise controlled features. "Then you are either very brave or very foolish." Silence settled over them, thick with tension. Then, as if the house itself could feel the weight of their words, a soft creak echoed through the walls, an unnatural sound in an empty corridor. Evelyn's gaze flicked toward the bookshelves, where dust patterns betrayed something recently moved. Her fingers traced along the wood, pausing at a slight indentation near the base, a concealed mechanism. With the gentlest pressure, the section of shelving shifted, revealing a narrow passage beyond, dark and yawning like an open throat. "Not afraid of the dark," she repeated, stepping forward. The door swung shut behind her with a whisper of finality, the others left behind as she descended into the unknown. The dim glow of a single hanging bulb illuminated the chaos strewn across the old workbench, wires twisted in impossible tangles, notes scrawled in an urgent slanted hand, and at the center of it all, a photograph curling at the edges. Evelyn Harrow lifted it carefully, her sharp gaze narrowing as she examined the grainy black and white image. Sir Alistair, younger, standing among men in military uniforms, their faces blurred, not by time, but deliberately obscured, details scratched out by a restless hand. One man, however, remained untouched, his smile out of place amid the others' grim expressions. She slipped the photograph into her handbag, a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture. The air in the underground chamber vibrated, not with the hum of machinery, but with the weight of something more, something unfinished. Against the far wall, half concealed beneath a dust-heavy tarp, something loomed. She reached out, grasping the fabric's edge, and with a single pull, unveiled a device that looked part radio, part military console, part fevered nightmare. Knobs, dials, and tangled wiring spread like veins across its surface. Above it, notes were pinned in hurried, frantic organization, some underlined twice, others circled in desperate emphasis. Unauthorized access prohibited, frequencies unstable, echo must not fall into the wrong hands. Evelyn's breath was steady, measured, but her pulse quickened as her fingers found a leather-bound journal beside the machine. She flipped it open. Sir Alistair's handwriting was precise, controlled, but beneath the ink lay the unmistakable tremor of a man at the edge of discovery or disaster. Echo is functional beyond all expectation, capable of intercepting military transmissions, decoding in real time, danger of misuse catastrophic, refused to hand over, morally impossible. Eleanor warned me, told her the truth, but not the full picture. If you are reading this, and I am gone, it was no accident. Evelyn's eyes flicked back to the machine. Echo, a device that could strip away secrecy, dismantle defenses, expose plans before they could be executed. In the wrong hands, wars could be decided before they began. She exhaled slowly, closing the journal and tucking it into her bag. Secrets never stayed buried. A floorboard above creaked. Not the subtle sigh of an old house settling, too deliberate, too heavy. She moved swiftly, retracing her steps, her boots whispering against the cold stone floor. The air thickened, weighted with the awareness that she was no longer alone. She slipped through the hidden passage, pressing the door shut behind her just as a shadow stretched across the threshold beyond. The manor above remained unchanged, indifferent to the tension thrumming beneath its walls. Outside, the world carried on. The village square, a patchwork of gossip and routine, continued its slow, unbothered rhythm. Doors opened, letters exchanged, conversations carried just loud enough to be overheard but never loud enough to be challenged. Evelyn stepped into the quiet hum of daily life, her hat angled just so, her pace unhurried, though her mind moved with practiced precision. Information had a way of finding those who did not seek it too eagerly. Outside the grocer's, Mrs. Whitmore stood behind her stall, hands deep in a basket of potatoes, tongue clucking over the state of the weather. "Storm coming," she murmured, though whether she meant the sky or something closer to home was unclear. Evelyn offered a knowing smile, selecting a modest bunch of carrots. Odd weather indeed. Mrs. Whitmore glanced around, then lowered her voice, though the stage whisper carried easily across the square. Saw the professor last night down at the inn. Him and that journalist, Miss Ferreira. Corner table, heads close. Not a casual chat, I'd wager. Evelyn arched a brow. They don't strike me as natural company. That's what I said, Mrs. Whitmore nodded, pleased with the validation. She's all charm and easy smiles, and he colder than a January frost. Something's brewing there, you mark my words. Evelyn's gaze remained thoughtful. People form the strangest alliances when circumstances demand it, or when they share secrets, Mrs. Whitmore added with a knowing look. Evelyn gave a small amused nod. Indeed. The church bells chimed the hour, their sound echoing through the cobbled streets, like a reminder that time and truth were relentless forces. Secrets had a way of surfacing. The question was who stood to lose the most when they did. The storm outside Hensley Manor had settled into a whispering drizzle, but inside, tension coiled thick as smoke. Conversations were clipped, glances quick and uneasy, as if the walls themselves were listening. Miss Marple, ever composed, requested a word with Professor Belvoir. He obliged with a sigh, his lean frame settling into the conservatory's armchair as rain traced ghostly fingers down the glass. You've been prying, he observed, crossing one leg over the other, his smile a flicker of something unreadable. You enjoy puzzles. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly, eyes sharp. Only when lives are at stake. She let the words linger, then added, Mrs. Pick observed you with Miss Ferreira last night. Odd given your apparent detachment. Belvoir's smile barely changed, but something in his posture tightened. Isabella chases stories. I chase facts. Sometimes our paths cross. Do you think we're conspiring? I find unlikely alliances often yield the most fruit, she countered. And you? Your grudge against the Hensleys seems rather persistent. Belvoir exhaled slowly, his gaze turning distant. Old history. My grandfather worked under Alistair's father, a brilliant man until his ideas were stolen, his name erased. The Hensleys flourished, and we were left in the dirt. His tone sharpened. I don't kill for old grievances, Miss Marple, but you should ask Elena why she's so desperate to bury certain truths. Such as, she prompted. But Belvoir simply stood, brushing imaginary dust from his trousers. Dig deep enough, Miss Marple, and you may not like what you find. He left her in silence, the rain streaking the glass between them like bars on a cage. Later, the manor's vast halls lay wrapped in uneasy quiet, the sort that made silence seem alive. Shadows stretched long, creeping like fingers across the polished floor. The grandfather clock groaned its discontent, 11:30. Miss Marple, clad in her usual sensible tweed, moved with careful intent along the dimly lit corridor. The hem of her skirt brushed against the worn runner, the faded floral pattern worn by decades of footfalls. Knitting needles safely tucked away, she kept both hands free. She was not one for dramatics, but tonight felt wrong. Too many polite smiles hiding sharper edges. A floorboard creaked. She stilled, pulse steady but mind racing. Someone was awake, or waiting. The corridor stretched before her, heavy oak doors to either side, the ornate staircase looming ahead. Candlelight from the wall sconces flickered, casting shifting shadows that played tricks on the eyes. Another sound, a weight shifting, a breath drawn too sharply. Oh dear, she murmured, voice calm but alert. A rather poor attempt at skulking. With deliberate slowness, she stepped forward, her fingers ghosting over the wallpaper's damask print. Expensive. Another creak. Then movement, sudden, swift. A shadow burst from behind a decorative column, gloved hands reaching too quick, too forceful. But Miss Marple had been expecting something. Reflexes honed by years of noticing what others didn't. She twisted, the shove hitting her shoulder instead of her back. Pain flared as she collided with the banister, fingers gripping the polished wood with the kind of strength that only survival demanded. Her feet found purchase, breath sharp but controlled. "Really," she exhaled, adjusting her hat with a gloved hand, "how very impolite." The figure bolted, footsteps hammering down the corridor. But Miss Marple did not give chase. That was not her way. Instead she straightened, brushed off her sleeve, and listened to the echoes vanishing into the depths of the manor. The game was afoot, and someone had just made a very dangerous mistake. Miss Marple steadied herself, fingers brushing the tender ache on her shoulder, steel blue eyes locking onto the vanishing shadow as it dissolved into the abyss below. The manor remained unnervingly still, no cries of alarm, no hurried footsteps, only the steady swallowing of sound, as if the house itself was complicit in the deception. Straightening her jacket with quiet dignity, she cast another glance at the grand staircase. A fall from there would have been quick, clean, irrevocable. No mess, no scandal, just another tragic accident in a house already thick with ghosts. Her lips thinned. "Too close," she murmured, barely a whisper against the ponderous tick of the grandfather clock, which resumed its patient countdown towards something inevitable. Later, in the sanctuary of her guest room, she pressed a cold compress to her shoulder, her reflection wavering in the darkened window. The rich furnishings, deep mahogany, plush velvet, the scent of old paper and older secrets, offered no comfort. The night pressed against the glass, thick with something unseen, something whispering at the edges of hearing. She retraced the evening steps in her mind, Colonel Vane's clipped speech, his eyes flicking away at the mention of Sir Alister's study. Charlotte Whittaker, twisting the strap of her satchel until the leather strained. Professor Belvoir, his smirk too polished, too controlled. Lady Eleanor Hensley, draped in mourning, grief measured and precise, like a veil pulled just tightly enough. And Isabella Ferreira, charming, keen-eyed, a journalist who knew exactly where to cut. The attempted push had confirmed it. This was no idle intrigue. Someone was afraid, and fear, she knew, was a terrible thing. It made people reckless. A faint smile played at her lips. Good. Reckless people made mistakes. Setting the compress aside, she reached for her notebook, fingers tracing the neatly penned notes, the small overlooked details that wove a story only she could see. One name, underlined twice, Sir Alister's study, secrets lived there. She'd stake her finest knitting needles on it. Outside, the wind sighed against the manor's stone walls. Inside, the detective's smile widened. The game had changed, and someone in Hensley Manor had just run out of places to hide. The grand drawing room had not held this many people since the last charity gala, but tonight the air was heavier, the silence stretched taut with something unsaid. The walls, lined with somber portraits of long-dead Hensleys, seemed to watch from their frames, their painted expressions frozen in knowing silence. Heavy drapes swallowed most of the afternoon light, leaving the room cast in long uncertain shadows. A fire sputtered in the hearth, flickering weakly, as though unwilling to illuminate what should remain hidden. At the center of it all sat Miss Marple, composed, unassuming, knitting needles clicking in steady rhythm, silver glinting like a whisper of steel. The sound was almost hypnotic, a metronome of patience and inevitability. People tended to talk when given enough silence. She glanced over her spectacles, her gaze sweeping the room like a knife. "We're all here then," she said, voice soft as a tea cake but weighted enough to quiet even the restless shuffling of the assembled guests. Colonel Richard Vane stood by the liquor cart, his untouched brandy clutched in one hand, his uniform immaculate, his impatience worn like armor. Charlotte Whittaker perched by the window, twisting a lace-edged handkerchief with nervous fingers. Professor Belvoir leaned against the mantel, arms folded, his smirk carved from something smug and unyielding. Isabella Ferreira sat poised on the arm of a chair, legs crossed, eyes darting between them all, mapping the exits, cataloguing the weaknesses. Lady Eleanor Hensley stood composed, her grief a portrait of perfect restraint. "Miss Marple," she said at last, her voice smooth, even. "If you have answers, I suggest you share them. We've all waited long enough." A pause, then the rhythmic clicking of knitting needles ceased. Miss Marple folded her hands over her lap, blue eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "Patience, dear," she murmured. "Patience is a virtue." Another pause, then in the hush that followed, she exhaled a slow breath, gaze settling like a weight upon the room. "Murder," she said, "has a way of making patience run thin." The words landed like a stone in still water. Professor Belvoir snorted, arms still folded. "Is this going somewhere, or are we to endure a lecture in yarn spinning?" "Ah," Miss Marple mused, "but you see, a good tapestry only reveals its pattern when all the threads are laid out." Her fingers traced the rim of her knitting needle absently. "And I do believe, my dear Professor, the threads are finally beginning to show." The storm had come in fast, thick sheets of rain lashing against the towering spires of Blackwood Hall, drowning the grounds in a murky silver haze. Inside, the fire flickered in its grand marble hearth, shadows stretching long across the panelled walls, where portraits of long-dead aristocrats watched in eternal judgment. Lady Evelyn Lockwood sat upright in her high-backed chair, her fingers poised over the delicate porcelain teacup that had long since gone cold. The gathered guests, an odd assortment of intellect and influence, had all but abandoned their polite pretenses, their eyes shifting warily as Detective Alistair Vaughan leaned forward, his presence like a blade pressed against thin silk. "Secrets," he mused, his voice a slow deliberate cut through the room's uneasy silence. "They have a way of festering in places like these." A single glance swept over them. Dr. Whitmore, his knuckles bloodless against the arms of his chair, Marianne Holloway, the ever-watchful journalist, whose pen had grown still for the first time that evening, Lord Stirling, a man who had built his empire on whispers and half-truths, now shifting uncomfortably beneath the detective's knowing gaze. "Sir Reginald Lisle did not die by accident," Vaughan continued, plucking a delicate silver letter opener from the table beside him, its polished edge catching the firelight. "Nor was his death a mere miscalculation. No, someone in this very room ensured he would never leave Blackwood Hall alive." A crack of thunder rattled the chandelier, and the tension in the room thickened, pressing against their lungs like damp earth on a coffin lid. "You see, the truth isn't merely buried beneath lies," Vaughan continued, twirling the letter opener between his fingers with an absent sort of amusement. "It is strangled, suffocated, drowned beneath the weight of convenience. But murder," his gaze snapped toward Marianne Holloway, who flinched, her fingers twitching toward her satchel, where her notebook lay thick with observations. "Murder leaves cracks in even the most carefully constructed facades." He let the moment settle, watching as the discomfort in their eyes deepened, as they began measuring each other's breaths, each movement a potential betrayal. "Dr. Whitmore," Vaughan said at last, his tone light but unyielding, "you were the last to see Sir Reginald alive, were you not?" The doctor stiffened, his lips parting, but before he could answer, Marianne cut in, her voice a thread too sharp to be casual. "That's not entirely true." Every eye turned to her, suspicion laced with the dark thrill of revelation. "I saw him too," she admitted, adjusting the strap of her satchel, as though its weight had grown unbearable. "And I saw someone else leaving his study that night." Silence clamped down like a vice, the very air in the room thickening. Vaughan merely smiled, slow and deliberate. "Ah," he murmured, setting the letter opener down with a quiet clink against the polished mahogany table. "Now that is interesting." The fire guttered in its hearth, the storm raged beyond the windows, and within Blackwood Hall, the past and present twisted together, waiting to ensnare the guilty in its tightening grip. The rain fell in slow, deliberate strokes against the tall arched windows of Ashbourne Manor, tracing silver rivulets down the old glass like the delicate fingers of an unseen hand. The house, a grand relic of an age past, stood in quiet defiance against the storm, its sprawling halls thick with secrets, its high chandeliers throwing flickering light against the dark paneled walls. In the drawing room, a fire crackled, sending errant embers spiraling upward, but the warmth did little to chase away the growing chill between those gathered. Lady Margaret Whitmore sat poised, her spine straight, her expression unreadable, though the tension in her hands betrayed the turmoil beneath. Across from her, Inspector James Calloway let his gaze drift over the faces before him, each shadowed by something more than mere exhaustion. "Dr. Langley," he said at last, his voice slicing through the heavy silence, "you were the last to speak with Lord Ashbourne before he died, were you not?" Langley, a man of scholarly precision, swallowed before answering. "Yes," he admitted, though his fingers tightened imperceptibly against the stem of his glass. "We spoke briefly," he seemed troubled, "but I thought nothing of it at the time." Calloway nodded, the flicker of a knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Troubled indeed," he mused, his eyes shifting now to Evelyn Mercer, the Manor's long-time governess, who had remained silent until now, her usual sharp wit dulled by the weight of the night's events. "And yet, Miss Mercer," Calloway continued, "you overheard something, didn't you?" A sharp intake of breath. Lady Whitmore's gloved fingers clenched against the arm of her chair. Miss Mercer hesitated, but under the inspector's unwavering gaze, she exhaled, resignation settling into her features. "He was arguing," she admitted. "But not with Dr. Langley. He was speaking with someone on the telephone. His voice was low, but urgent. A flicker of lightning illuminated the room in a stark, fleeting tableau. Dr. Langley stiff in his chair, Lady Whitmore's eyes dark pools of calculation, Evelyn Mercer drawn taut with unease. "And what," Calloway pressed, "did he say?" Miss Mercer swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said, 'It's too late. I know everything.'" The room, already heavy with expectation, now seemed to hold its breath. Calloway leaned back, thoughtful. "Curious, isn't it? A man about to reveal something, and then he's dead." He let the words settle, let them fester, before turning, almost lazily, to face Julian Ashbourne, the nephew, the only heir, and the one who had remained suspiciously quiet through it all. Lord Ashbourne was poisoned, Calloway stated, his tone almost conversational. A precise dose slipped into his brandy, not an easy thing to accomplish without familiarity or opportunity. Julian's expression remained impassive, but the flicker of something deep in his gaze did not escape the inspector's notice. "And you," Calloway murmured, "had both." A slow, dangerous silence stretched between them, as the fire crackled, as the rain whispered against the glass, as the grand old house seemed to listen, waiting for the unraveling of its darkest thread. The train exhaled a deep, weary sigh as it rolled into the station, steam curling in ghostly tendrils around the iron columns, the damp wood of the platform gleaming under the hesitant morning light. Miss Eleanor Graves stood just beyond the line of waiting passengers, her posture composed but her eyes sharp, watching the departing travelers with the quiet patience of someone accustomed to seeing things others missed. Beside her, Inspector Harrow adjusted his coat against the chill, his gaze flicking toward the woman in the deep green traveling cloak boarding the third carriage. "You're certain?" he murmured, voice low enough to be lost beneath the hiss of the engine. Eleanor's gloved fingers twitched against the strap of her handbag. "She lied about knowing him," she said almost absently, eyes never leaving the woman. "People always think the first lie is enough. They forget it breeds others." The conductor called for last boarding. The woman stepped inside, disappearing behind the fogged glass of the compartment window. Harrow exhaled through his nose. "If she's running, she won't get far." "She's not running," Eleanor corrected. "She's finishing something." A pause, then Harrow's jaw tightened. "You think the blueprint still exists?" "I think something exists," she murmured, watching as the train lurched forward, wheels clanking into motion, dragging its secrets away into the misty horizon. The hush of departure settled over the station, the scent of coal and rain thick in the air. Eleanor turned, her gaze drifting to the telegraph office at the far end of the platform. A single lamp burned within, the operator hunched over his desk, tapping out a message with the rhythmic precision of a man oblivious to the weight of the words he carried. She stepped forward, Harrow falling into pace beside her. "If there are copies," she said, "they'll surface soon enough. And if they do, we'll be ready," Harrow finished. Eleanor nodded, but the tightness in her throat remained. The world had a way of pretending the past was buried, that things forgotten stayed that way. But she knew better. Some threads, once pulled, unraveled everything. The morning air carried the distant sound of the train's whistle, its cry a lingering note of unfinished business. Eleanor Graves tightened her grip on her handbag. This wasn't over, not yet. The last echo of the departing train faded into the damp morning air, leaving behind only the rhythmic ticking of the station clock and the lingering scent of coal and rain. Eleanor Harrow stood motionless, her gloved fingers tightening around the handle of her umbrella, eyes fixed on the empty tracks as though they might whisper the answers that still eluded her. The confession had come too easily, too neatly wrapped in old resentments and convenient betrayals. Professor Belvoir had played his part well, too well. Guilt had poured from his lips with the practiced precision of a man who understood the value of a well-timed sacrifice. But real guilt festered, tangled itself in hesitation, contradiction. His had been smooth, deliberate, and that troubled her. The foreign backers, the phrase gnawed at the edges of her thoughts. Easy villains, nameless shadows to cast blame upon when the truth was too inconvenient. But power never hid in the shadows. It thrived in parlors and boardrooms, behind polished desks and well-inked contracts. The theft of the designs, the deaths, the hurried destruction of Project Arcadia's blueprints, it was not the work of men seeking mere revenge. This was something larger, something still breathing beneath the surface. A gust of wind stirred the platform, sending a newspaper fluttering against her boot. She bent, picking it up, eyes skimming the front page. The headline spoke of politics, shifting alliances, trade negotiations, the usual distractions. But buried in the fine print, almost an afterthought, was a notice of an unexpected resignation from a research post in Vienna. A name she recognized, a name that did not belong in the periphery of a mundane news cycle. She folded the paper, slipping it into her handbag. The world was good at moving on, at burying its secrets beneath the weight of daily life. But loose ends had a way of resurfacing, and Eleanor had spent too many years pulling at the threads others ignored. A porter passed by, nodding as he hauled a heavy case toward the luggage cart. "London by noon, miss," he remarked in passing. She nodded absently, her mind already miles ahead, tracing the path of whispers, the unseen hand guiding this game. Somewhere, someone still held a piece of the puzzle, and Eleanor intended to find them, before they found her. London, she murmured, though not as a destination but as a question. Answers might be waiting there, buried in forgotten letters, in hushed parlors where reputations were salvaged over brandy and cigar smoke, or perhaps more likely, questions had only changed their disguises, donning finer coats, speaking in softer tones, but never truly vanishing. Eleanor stood a moment longer, gazing at the disappearing train, not for sentiment, but for the habit of watching things depart, people, secrets, certainty. Some left clean breaks, others trailed behind like shadows, never fully shaken. When she finally turned, her steps carried her away from the station with the same measured grace as always, not hurried, not hesitant, simply moving, the way time did, dragging truths along with it. She returned to Milford, where the morning sun dappled over cobbled streets, still slick from the night's rain, where smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and neighbors traded pleasantries over fences with cups of tea in hand. A village that, to the untrained eye, seemed untouched by scandal, but Eleanor knew better. Beneath well-kept hedgerows, and behind lace-curtained windows, life whispered of untold things. She passed the post office where Mrs. Kilburn, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, was already sorting through letters, pausing every so often to examine a handwriting that seemed unfamiliar. At the market square, the butcher, Mr. Owens, exchanged a tight-lipped nod with a man in a brown coat, an outsider passing through, or perhaps someone who had simply learned how to blend in. Familiarity was the best disguise of all. At home, Eleanor knelt among her roses, her shears gliding through stems with practiced precision. The scent of earth, damp and rich, mingled with the sweetness of the blooms. It was a moment of peace, but not stillness. Her mind never rested. The events at Ashcombe Manor were behind her now, yet they lingered in her thoughts, an unfinished thread she had not quite unravelled. A confession had been made, a crime had been punished, yet something in the air still felt unsettled, like a room where someone had recently left but their presence remained. A shadow without a source. A note without a signature. "Morning, Miss Harrow," came a voice from the gate. Mrs. Pratt stood there, her shopping basket in one hand, her eyes bright with the kind of curiosity that thrived in small villages. "Out with the roses again, I see." Eleanor straightened, brushing soil from her gloves. "They require tending much like everything else." "So true," Mrs. Pratt agreed, leaning in as if proximity might yield more information. "Did you hear about the telegram that came in for Dr. Fenwick? Strange, don't you think? He never gets telegrams. A test, a lure." Eleanor only smiled, trimming another rose. "Perhaps an old acquaintance." "Perhaps," Mrs. Pratt echoed, though her tone suggested she did not believe it. "Well, I mustn't keep you," and with that she bustled away, her hat wobbling with every step. Eleanor watched her go, then turned her gaze to the sky. A storm was coming, not in the weather, but in the shifting of things unseen. She could feel it, just as she could sense the weight of eyes lingering too long, the pause in a sentence where truth might have slipped through. Loose threads, always there if one knew where to look. The village of Ashcombe Hollow woke slowly, as if reluctant to leave the comfort of its dreams. Mist clung to the hedgerows, dissolving as the sun crept higher, spilling golden light over damp rooftops and curling chimney smoke. Miss Evelyn Harcourt knelt in her garden, pruning shears glinting in her gloved hands as she worked with quiet efficiency. Lavender and rosemary swayed under the touch of a gentle breeze, their fragrance mixing with the scent of rain-soaked earth. It was the kind of morning that made trouble feel distant, but Miss Harcourt had long learned that beneath the pleasant hum of village life, secrets thrived like weeds among the roses. A sharp rap against the garden gate interrupted her thoughts. She glanced up to find Mrs. Prudence Weatherby, leaning over, her ever-present shopping basket hooked over one arm, eyes alight with the thrill of knowing something no one else did. "Miss Harcourt, dreadful business this morning," she whispered, as if the hedges might be listening. "Dr. Litchfield's house, broken into—" She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "Nothing taken, mind you, but his study, ransacked, papers everywhere. The strangest thing," Miss Harcourt set aside her shears, dusting her gloves, "a break-in with no theft. Unusual, exactly what I said." Mrs. Weatherby huffed, "And you know how he is, keeps to himself, never a friendly word, always slipping about with those packages at odd hours. Mark my words, he's hiding something." Her voice dropped further. "And remember Anna Foster, that poor girl who worked for him, disappeared without a word last month. Left in the dead of night, they say. Or so he claimed." She leaned in, her excitement barely concealed. What if she never left at all? Miss Harcourt met her gaze, her expression unreadable. A house of secrets, a missing girl, a study ransacked, but valuables untouched. The pieces did not quite fit, but then mysteries seldom did at first glance. "Well," Mrs. Weatherby sighed, "I must be off. Mr. Weatherby will be wanting his chops, and you know how he gets." She bustled down the lane, her basket swinging. Miss Harcourt watched her go, then turned back to her garden, but her thoughts were elsewhere. drifting beyond the hedgerows to the darkened windows of the Lichfield house, where curtains never stirred, and secrets had a way of refusing to stay buried. She straightened slowly, wiping a speck of dirt from her cheek. The village would move on, as it always did, but some things, some whispers, had a way of lingering, waiting for the right moment to step into the light.